The crystal chandelier cast fractured light across the mahogany table where death sat disguised as a business dinner. Amara Williams moved through Meridian's private dining room with practiced grace, her black uniform crisp against her rich brown skin, serving plates that cost more than most people earned in a week. She had learned long ago that wealthy men conducting hushed conversations prefer their servers invisible, so she perfected the art of being present without being seen. The restaurant hummed with quiet efficiency around her, the soft clink of crystal, the whisper of expensive fabric against leather chairs, the carefully modulated voices of those who never needed to raise them to command attention. Amara had worked establishments like this for 3 years, ever since graduating with her business degree, using the flexible hours to save money while she planned her next move. She understood the rhythm of power, the way deals were sealed over perfectly prepared meals, the delicate dance of respect and intimidation that wealthy men performed with each other. Tonight's gathering felt different from the usual corporate dinner she served. The men around the table carried themselves with a particular kind of stillness, the controlled alertness of those accustomed to violence. Their suits were impeccable, their manners polished, but underneath the civilized veneer ran currents of something far more dangerous. From across the country, viewers are watching this story unfold. I'm curious, where are you tuning in from tonight? Does your city have restaurants where power and danger intersect like this? Comment below and let me know what state you're watching from. She noticed how they never fully relaxed, how their eyes swept the room in patterns that suggested military training or something darker. When she leaned forward to place the appetizer course, she caught fragments of conversation that made her skin prickle with unease. Territory boundaries, shipping routes, consequences for disrespect. The words drifted past her like smoke, but their meaning was clear enough. These men dealt in violence the way others dealt in stocks and bonds, with cold precision and calculated risk. The man at the head of the table commanded attention without effort. Jinwoo Park sat with the stillness of a predator, his charcoal suit tailored to perfection, every line emphasizing the controlled power beneath. His dark eyes tracked each person in the room with surgical precision, missing nothing, revealing less. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, each word measured and deliberate. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps early 30s, with the kind of presence that made expensive rooms feel small. His black hair was swept back with precision, revealing a face that could have belonged to a corporate executive or a classical sculpture, all sharp angles and controlled intensity. But it was his hands that told the real story. She noticed as she refilled his water glass. They rested on the table with deceptive casualness, but the scars across his knuckles spoke of violence that extended far beyond boardroom negotiations. When their eyes met briefly as she served his course, Amara felt the full weight of his attention like a physical force. He assessed her with the same calculating precision he applied to everything else, taking in details she was certain he would remember long after she had left the room. There was something unsettling about being truly seen by someone who wielded that kind of power, even for the few seconds it took to place his plate before him. Negotiations flow through numbers and territory, through respect and consequences, she noticed. The other men at the table deferred to him with the careful respect reserved for those who held life and death in their hands. Jinwoo's fingers rested loosely on the table, but Amara caught the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked periodically to the exits. A man accustomed to danger, even in the sanctuary of an upscale restaurant. The conversation centered around shipping contracts and port access, but beneath the business terminology lay something far more sinister. References to cleaning up problems and ensuring cooperation carried implications that made Amara's stomach tighten with unease. She had grown up in neighborhoods where violence was currency, where territory meant survival, and she recognized the language even when it was dressed in corporate speak. Jinwoo dominated the discussion with quiet intensity, his voice never rising above conversational level, yet somehow commanding absolute attention. When he outlined consequences for broken agreements, The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. His associates nodded with the grim understanding of men who had seen those consequences implemented before. The sake arrived, and she poured it with practiced precision, noting how each man watched the liquid level with the attention of someone assessing potential threats. In their world, she realized, even hospitality could be weaponized. Even a shared meal could be the prelude to execution. She refilled water glasses, her presence so seamless that conversations continued without pause. Years of working in establishments like Meridian had taught her to read the currents of power that flowed between successful men. Tonight felt different. The tension stretched tighter than usual, like a wire about to snap. As she moved around the table, Amara caught glimpses of the larger picture being discussed. Territory disputes along the waterfront. Challenges to establish boundaries. The kind of conflicts that were resolved with blood rather than lawyers when they involved men like these. Jinwoo spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to having his words treated as law, but she sensed an underlying wariness that suggested tonight's meeting carried higher stakes than usual. The men across from him were harder to read, their deference tinged with something that might have been resentment or calculation. They nodded at his directives with the compliance of those who had no choice, but their eyes held the cold assessment of predators waiting for weakness. Amara had learned to recognize that look in the faces of men who survive by their willingness to kill when opportunity presented itself. The first sign of trouble came when the lights in the main dining room flickered. Jinwoo's head turned toward the sound of raised voices beyond the private room's doors. His entire demeanor shifted, the careful businessman mask sliding away to reveal something far more lethal underneath. "Move to the kitchen," he commanded the room without raising his voice. Every man at the table rose with fluid precision, hands disappearing inside jackets to find weapons. Every man except Jinwoo, who remained seated, his dark eyes now focused entirely on the sounds beyond their sanctuary. The subtle transformation was terrifying to witness. These men she had been serving dinner to revealed themselves as predators, their civilized veneer dissolving to expose the violence that defined their existence. Jinwoo's associates moved with the coordinated efficiency of a military unit, taking defensive positions around the room while their leader remained motionless at the table, his attention focused on calculations that would determine whether they lived or died in the next few minutes. The doors burst open. 5 men in dark suits entered with weapons drawn, their faces set with deadly purpose. Amara pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering as she recognized the systematic way they moved, the practiced choreography of violence about to unfold. The first shots were fired before she could process what was happening. Jinwoo's men returned fire with professional precision, but they were outnumbered and caught off guard. The elegant dining room transformed into a battlefield, crystal shattering, wood splintering, the scent of gunpowder mixing with a lingering aroma of expensive cuisine. "You were warned about coming here tonight," one of the intruders said, his accent thick with barely controlled rage. "Your territory ends at the river, park. This was a message you chose not to hear." Jinwoo rose slowly, his movements controlled despite the guns trained on him. The men who had been dining with him lay motionless on the floor, eliminated with swift efficiency, while Amara had been frozen in shock. Blood pooled on the expensive carpet, dark against the cream silk. "I received your message," Jinwoo replied, his voice steady despite the odds. "I simply found it unconvincing." His eyes found Amara pressed against the wall, taking in her terror with something that might have been regret. The lead gunman smiled without warmth. "Then perhaps this will be more persuasive." The sound of additional vehicles outside meant reinforcements were arriving. Jinwoo's jaw tightened as he calculated odds that were rapidly deteriorating. His usual exits were blocked, his security detail neutralized, his carefully controlled world collapsing around him. In the space between heartbeats, Amara watched the most powerful man in the city realize that his power meant nothing when surrounded by enemies with nothing left to lose. In that moment of desperate calculation, Jinwoo Park did something he had never done in 20 years of commanding respect through fear. He turned to the waitress, trembling against the wall, and let every mask fall away. "Please save me," he said, his voice raw with an honesty that made the entire room fall silent. His dark eyes met hers with desperate intensity. "You know this building better than any of us. Please." The words hung in the air like a prayer. The most powerful man in the city, surrounded by his enemies, had just begged a waitress for salvation. Amara stared into his face and saw not the dangerous authority figure who had commanded the room moments before, but a man stripped down to nothing but hope. Her mind raced through the building's layout, through service corridors and maintenance exits that wealthy diners never saw. The men holding the guns were focused on Jinwoo, treating her as part of the furniture, invisible and harmless. They had made the same mistake that powerful men always made, assuming that someone like her posed no threat, carried no power, mattered only as collateral damage. She made her choice. The service elevator, she whispered, so quietly that only Jinwoo could hear. "Behind the wine storage. 30 seconds when I create a distraction." What happened next would change both their lives forever, binding them together in ways neither could have imagined when the evening began with nothing more dangerous than an expensive dinner. Amara slammed the glass tray against the closest attacker's temple with all the strength fear could provide. The sound of crystal shattering mixed with his grunt of pain as he staggered backward, blood streaming down his face. In the chaos that followed, Jinwoo moved like liquid death, using the distraction to reach the hidden service door she had indicated. "Run," he commanded, his hand briefly touching her shoulder as they slipped through the narrow corridor that led to the kitchen's back exit. Behind them, angry voices shouted orders, but the service hallways of Meridian were a maze that only the staff knew intimately. 3 days later, Amara stood in her small apartment, trying to convince herself that life could return to normal. She had called in sick to work, knowing that Meridian would be closed indefinitely, while police investigated what the news reports carefully described as a business dispute that turned violent. 5 men dead, they said. No mention of the waitress who helped one man escape, or the way that man had looked at her when he pressed a business card into her palm before disappearing into the night. The card sat on her kitchen table like a loaded weapon. Jinwoo Park, it read in simple black lettering, followed by a phone number that somehow felt more dangerous than the guns that had been pointed at her 3 nights ago. Her hand still shook when she thought about what she had done. The crystalline moment of choice when she could have stayed silent, stayed invisible, let whatever was going to happen run its course without her involvement. Instead, she had chosen to act, to save a man whose world was violence wrapped in expensive suits and quiet authority. She had replayed the escape 100 times in her mind. The way he had moved through the service corridors with deadly grace, never questioning her directions, trusting her knowledge of the building completely. His hand on her back as they descended the emergency stairs, guiding rather than pushing, protective even in their desperate flight. The moment at the loading dock when he had turned to her, his dark eyes holding something that might have been gratitude or calculation, before pressing the card into her palm and disappearing into a waiting car. The news reports had been carefully sanitized. A business dispute that escalated to violence, they said. No mention of territory wars or organized crime. No interviews with witnesses who might complicate the official narrative. Amara had watched the coverage with growing unease, recognizing the way information was being managed, shaped, controlled by people with the power to decide what the public needed to know. The knock at her door came at 7 in the morning, soft and polite, but somehow final in its certainty. Amara peered through the peephole and felt her stomach drop. Jinwoo Park stood in her hallway with 2 men in identical dark suits, his presence making the narrow corridor feel like a throne room. She hesitated with her hand on the deadbolt, knowing that opening this door would change everything. Through the thin wood, she could feel the weight of their patience, the certainty that her cooperation was not really optional. Her neighbors would be waking up soon, getting ready for their normal lives, lives that no longer included the luxury of believing that violence was something that happened to other people in other places. She opened the door because refusing felt more dangerous than complying. He filled her doorway with that same controlled stillness she remembered from the restaurant. But now she could see the calculation behind his dark eyes as he assessed her apartment, her neighborhood, her vulnerability with clinical precision. This morning he looked different without the formal dinner setting to frame him. Still impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, but somehow more human in the mundane setting of her apartment hallway. The harsh fluorescent lighting revealed details she had missed in the restaurant. The faint scar along his jawline, the careful way he held his left shoulder that suggested an injury not yet fully healed from their escape. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice carrying that same quiet authority that had commanded a room full of dangerous men. "May I come in? We need to talk." It was not really a question. Amara stepped aside, acutely aware of how small her space felt with him inside it. Her apartment was clean but modest, the furniture carefully chosen for durability rather than style, everything organized with the efficiency of someone who had learned to make a little money stretch far. She watched him take in these details with the same thoroughness he had applied to assessing threats at the restaurant. His men remained in the hallway, but their presence was still felt through the thin walls. Jinwoo moved to her living room window, looking down at the street below with the attention of someone who saw potential danger in every parked car, every passerby. "You saved my life," he said without preamble, turning to face her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "That creates an obligation." Amara crossed her arms, finding her voice despite the surreal nature of having a crime boss in her living room. "I don't want anything from you. I did what anyone would have done." His smile held no warmth. "No, Miss Williams. What you did was extraordinary, and it has consequences. By helping me escape, you identified yourself to my enemies. They will use you to get to me unless I prevent it." The words settled over her like ice water. She had not considered that her moment of compassion might have painted a target on her back, that saving his life might have endangered her own. But looking at his face, she could see he was not speaking in hypotheticals. "What does that mean?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "It means you cannot return to your normal life until the threat is eliminated. It means you need protection that only I can provide. It means you will come with me, now, to a place where they cannot reach you." The casual way he delivered this ultimatum made her anger flare. She had spent her entire adult life fighting for independence, working multiple jobs to put herself through college, building a future that belonged to her alone. The idea of surrendering that autonomy to anyone, especially to a man who wielded power like a weapon, sparked a rebellion that surprised them both. "No," she said firmly. "I appreciate the warning, but I can take care of myself. I have been doing it for years." Jinwoo studied her for a long moment, his expression shifting from expectation to something that might have been respect. "You're stronger than most people who find themselves in this situation," he said quietly. "But strength alone will not stop a bullet fired by someone seeking revenge against me." The words were delivered with the same clinical precision he might use to discuss a business transaction, but Amara caught the underlying concern that humanized them. He was not threatening her, she realized. He was trying to make her understand a reality that her normal life had never prepared her to face. "Then maybe you should have considered that before you put me in this position," Amara replied, her voice sharp with frustrated anger. "Maybe you should have found another way out of that restaurant that did not involve dragging an innocent person into your war." The accusation hung between them like a challenge. She watched his face carefully, looking for some sign of the man who had begged for her help, who had shown her a moment of absolute vulnerability when his carefully constructed world collapsed around him. What she saw instead was the return of that controlled mask, but beneath it something that might have been genuine regret. "You believe I used you," he said after a long pause. "That I calculated the risk to your safety against my own survival and found it acceptable. Did you not?" she challenged. "No." In that moment, I was not thinking like a strategist or a leader. I was thinking like a man who was about to die, and you were the only person in that room who represented hope instead of threat. His voice carried a raw honesty that surprised them both. If I had been thinking clearly, I would have found another way. But desperation does not allow for careful calculation. For the first time since entering her apartment, Jinwoo's controlled mask slipped slightly. She saw a flicker of something that might have been regret, quickly suppressed, but real enough to humanize him for a moment. "You were right," he said after a pause. "This is my fault, but the reality remains unchanged. There are men who will kill you simply because they believe it will hurt me. I cannot allow that to happen. Because of your obligation," she said, the word bitter on her tongue. "No, because it would be wrong." His voice carried a conviction that surprised her. "Because you risked your life to save mine when you had no reason to trust me, no promise of reward, no guarantee of safety. Because you saw a human being in danger and chose compassion over self-preservation." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. Amara felt some of her anger soften, replaced by the unwilling recognition that beneath his dangerous authority lay something resembling conscience. "How long?" she asked finally. "Until the men who want me dead are no longer a threat to you. Until I can guarantee your safety without my protection. That'll be months. Years." "Yes," he agreed without apology. "It could be." The honesty was almost worse than evasion would have been. At least a lie would have given her false hope to cling to, some illusion that this disruption to her life would be temporary and manageable. Instead, he was asking her to accept that everything she had worked to build might be lost permanently, that her independence and carefully planned future were now secondary to her survival. She walked to the window where he had been standing, looking down at the street that had been her neighborhood for 3 years. Mrs. Chun was already hanging laundry on her fire escape, the same routine she had followed every morning since Amara moved in. The coffee shop on the corner was opening, its owner setting up sidewalk tables that would soon be filled with regular customers pursuing their familiar rhythms. Everything looked the same, but she knew that illusion of normalcy was already shattered. The moment she had chosen to help him, her quiet life had become forfeit. The question was whether accepting his protection would preserve what remained of her autonomy, or simply make her complicit in her own captivity. She walked to the window where he had been standing, looking down at the street that had been her neighborhood for 3 years. Everything looked the same, but she knew that illusion of normalcy was already shattered. The moment she had chosen to help him, her quiet life had become forfeit. "Where?" she asked, not looking at him. "I have a compound outside the city. You will have your own quarters, your privacy, access to anything you need. This is protection, Miss Williams, not imprisonment." The distinction felt academic when the alternative was death. Amara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of a choice that was not really a choice at all. When she opened them again, Jinwoo was watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something between concern and calculation. "What about my job, my lease, my life?" she asked, hearing the break in her own voice. "Your employment at Meridian was terminated when the restaurant closed indefinitely," he said with the efficiency of someone who had already investigated every detail of her existence. "Your lease will be handled. Your possessions will be moved or stored as you prefer. Your life will continue, but under different circumstances." The thoroughness of his preparation was unsettling, suggesting that her compliance had never really been in question. He had not come here to negotiate, she realized. He had come to inform her of a decision that had already been made, to offer her the illusion of choice while maneuvering her toward the only outcome he would accept. "You investigated me," she said, anger flaring again. "I protect what is mine," he replied simply, then seemed to realize how that sounded. "What is under my protection?" he corrected, but the initial phrasing lingered between them like a promise or threat. "1 hour to pack what you need," he said softly. "My men will handle the rest." As she moved toward her bedroom to gather her things, Amara realized that her old life was ending whether she was ready or not. The woman who had served dinner to dangerous men was being replaced by someone whose existence was now inextricably linked to the most dangerous man of all. She packed quickly and efficiently, choosing practical clothes over sentimental items, focusing on necessities rather than the small treasures that made an apartment feel like home. Behind her, she could hear Jinwoo speaking quietly on his phone, arranging details with the same precision he had used to command the restaurant meeting. When she emerged with her single suitcase, he was waiting by the door with that same patient stillness that seemed to define him. For a moment, their eyes met, and she saw something in his expression that might have been apology or understanding. "Ready?" he asked, though they both knew readiness was irrelevant. The drive to his compound took them through neighborhoods that grew progressively more expensive, then more isolated, until they reached gates that looked more like military fortifications than residential security. As they passed through multiple checkpoints, each manned by guards who recognized Jinwoo's car with respectful efficiency, Amara began to understand the scope of the world she was entering. The question that terrified her most was not what would happen next, but why the prospect of being under his protection felt less like captivity and more like stepping into a world where she might finally discover who she truly was when safety was not something she had to fight for every single day. The compound revealed itself to be less fortress and more estate, though the distinction blurred when every gardener carried concealed weapons and the kitchen staff moved with the disciplined awareness of trained security. Amara's quarters occupied an entire wing of the main house, complete with a sitting room, bedroom, and private bath that rivaled luxury hotels she had only seen in magazines. Jinwoo had not lied about her privacy. Her rooms came with electronic locks that she controlled from the inside, windows that faced gardens rather than guard posts, and space enough to pace when the reality of her situation threatened to overwhelm her. The message was clear. This was protection, not imprisonment, even if the practical difference felt minimal when stepping outside meant encountering armed men at every turn. Her first morning, she woke to find fresh clothes in her exact size hanging in the closet, along with toiletries she recognized as her preferred brands. The thoroughness of his preparation should have felt invasive, but instead it spoke to an attention to detail that was almost considerate. He had noticed things about her that most people who served never bothered to observe. Breakfast arrived on fine china, perfectly prepared and elegantly presented. Korean tea, accompanied by fresh fruit, pastries that were still warm from the oven, and coffee that had been brewed exactly to her taste. When she mentioned to the server that she preferred her eggs over easy rather than scrambled, the adjustment appeared the next morning without her needing to ask twice. Small gestures, but they suggested a man who understood that control exercised through comfort was more effective than control exercised through fear. Jinwoo was revealing himself to be far more sophisticated than the typical criminal boss who relied solely on intimidation to maintain power. She encountered him 3 days into her residency, emerging from what appeared to be his private office as she explored the library he had mentioned during their drive to the compound. He moved with that same controlled precision she remembered, but here in his own space, there was a relaxation to his posture that made him seem more human and somehow more dangerous at the same time. "Miss Williams," he greeted her with a slight incline of his head. "I trust you are finding everything satisfactory." "The library is impressive," she replied, gesturing to the floor-to-ceiling shelves that surrounded them. "I did not expect to find first-edition literature in a place like this." "A place like what?" he asked, and she caught the slight amusement in his voice. "A criminal enterprise," she said directly, meeting his gaze without apology. His smile was barely perceptible, but genuine. "Criminals can appreciate beauty and knowledge, Miss Williams. Perhaps especially those of us who deal in ugliness professionally." The admission surprised her with its honesty. Most powerful men she had encountered preferred to dress their activities in euphemisms to maintain the fiction that their success came through purely legitimate means. Jinwoo spoke about his world without pretense, acknowledging its darkness while neither glorifying nor apologizing for it. She began to observe his daily routines, partly from curiosity and partly from the survivor's instinct to understand her environment. Jinwoo conducted business with the same meticulous attention he applied to everything else, reviewing reports with the focus of a scholar, making decisions with careful deliberation rather than impulsive emotion. His meetings revealed a strategic mind that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. She watched him negotiate shipping contracts that were obviously fronts for less legal enterprises, mediate disputes between subordinates with the wisdom of someone who understood human nature intimately, and plan operations with the precision of a military commander. What struck her most was the respect he commanded through competence rather than fear. His men followed him because they believed in his judgment, not because they were terrified of the consequences of disobedience. The loyalty was genuine, earned rather than extorted, which made him far more formidable than leaders who ruled only through intimidation. The first moment of physical connection came unexpectedly during one of his late-night returns from business that had clearly not gone as planned. She found him in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, attempting to tend to a gash on his forearm while balancing his phone against his shoulder, still conducting damage control for whatever had transpired. "You need proper medical attention," she said, setting down the book she had been reading and approaching him with the same calm competence she had shown during the restaurant crisis. "It is nothing," he replied automatically, but she was already reaching for the first aid supplies she had noticed in one of the kitchen drawers during her exploration of the space. "Let me," she said simply, and, after a moment of hesitation, he set down the phone and allowed her to examine the wound. Her touch was gentle but efficient as she cleaned the cut and applied antiseptic, her fingers steady despite the intimacy of caring for someone who had been a stranger less than a week ago. Jinwoo remained motionless under her ministrations, but she could feel the tension radiating from him, as if her gentleness was somehow more challenging to endure than violence. "You have medical training?" he asked quietly. "I worked as a nursing assistant through college," she replied, focusing on wrapping the bandage with proper tension. "Before I decided that serving people food was less emotionally exhausting than serving their medical needs." "But you chose to help anyway," he observed. She met his eyes as she secured the final edge of the bandage. "I seem to have a pattern of helping people who probably do not deserve it." The comment hung between them with subtle challenge, but when she looked up, Jinwoo's expression held something she had not seen before. Not the controlled authority or calculated assessment that usually defined his interactions, but something approaching gratitude mixed with surprise. "Why?" he asked. The simple question carried weight beyond its brevity. She understood that he was not asking about the bandage, but about everything. Why she had helped him escape. Why she had agreed to come here. Why she continued to treat him like a human being worthy of care instead of a predator to be feared or manipulated. "Because everyone deserves to be seen as more than the worst thing they have ever done," she said after considering her words carefully. "Because you asked for help instead of demanding it. And that makes you different from most powerful men I have encountered." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor that revealed vulnerability he clearly did not show to many people. For a moment, she glimpsed the man beneath the reputation. Someone who had perhaps been waiting his entire life for someone to see him as more than the sum of his necessary cruelties. Their conversations began to extend beyond basic courtesy. Jinwoo would find reasons to seek her opinion on matters that had nothing to do with security or her protection. When he mentioned a shipping problem that was costing his organization significant money, she offered insights drawn from her business education that helped him see alternative solutions his advisors had missed. "You have an interesting perspective," he said after she suggested a supply chain modification that would reduce both costs and exposure to law enforcement scrutiny. "Most people in my world think only in terms of force and intimidation. Maybe that is why your world has shipping problems," she replied with a directness that was becoming natural between them. His laugh surprised them both, genuine amusement replacing the controlled politeness that usually characterized his responses. The sound transformed his face, revealing glimpses of who he might have been in a different life, under different circumstances. "You are not afraid of me," he said, as if the realization puzzled him. "Should I be?" she asked. "Yes," he replied honestly. "Most people are. I have been afraid every day since that night in the restaurant," she admitted. "But not of you, of the situation, of losing my independence, of what this means for my future. But not of you personally." The distinction seemed to matter to him in ways she was only beginning to understand. Jinwoo had built his power on the ability to inspire fear, to make others calculate the cost of crossing him as too high to consider. Her lack of personal terror toward him represented something unprecedented in his experience, a form of acceptance that had nothing to do with submission and everything to do with seeing him clearly. As the days passed, she began to recognize the loneliness that surrounded him despite being constantly attended by staff and advisors. Command was isolating, she realized, especially when that command was maintained through the kind of strength that made genuine intimacy seem impossible. But in their conversations, she glimpsed the intelligence and even occasional humor that existed beneath his careful control. Jinwoo was capable of surprising gentleness when he forgot to maintain his guard, revealing thoughtfulness that suggested his protection of her went beyond mere obligation or strategy. The attraction that grew between them felt as dangerous as it was undeniable. She caught him watching her sometimes with an intensity that had nothing to do with security concerns and everything to do with a hunger he clearly had no intention of acting upon. The restraint he showed, the careful distance he maintained despite their growing connection, revealed a respect for her autonomy that made him more appealing rather than less. She was falling for a man whose world was violence, whose protection came with costs she was only beginning to understand, whose very existence in her life guaranteed that normalcy would never again be possible. The smart choice would be to maintain emotional distance, to survive this arrangement without compromising her heart. But as she watched him command his dangerous world with competence and unexpected honor, Amara began to suspect that the smart choice and the right choice might be two entirely different things. The scars on his hands told stories Jinwoo had never shared with anyone, but Amara had learned to read them during the 2 weeks she had lived under his protection. The thin white line across his knuckles spoke of broken glass, probably from his first real fight. The burn mark on his palm suggested childhood poverty, the kind where stealing food meant risking punishment that left permanent reminders. She discovered this during their third late-night encounter in the kitchen, when insomnia drove them both to seek the comfort of warm tea and the strange intimacy of shared silence. Jinwoo had been reviewing security reports of the marble counter, his shirt sleeves rolled up in a rare display of informality, when she noticed him favoring his left hand. "Old injury?" she asked, nodding toward the careful way he held his pen. "Many old injuries," he replied, following her gaze to his scarred knuckles. The cost of growing up where strength was the only currency that mattered. The admission surprised her with its honesty. In the restaurant, he had seemed like a man who had always possessed power, who had been born into authority rather than forced to earn it through violence. Now she began to understand that his controlled stillness was armor forged through necessity, not privilege. "Where did you grow up?" she asked, settling onto the stool beside him with 2 cups of the jasmine tea that had become their midnight ritual. "Streets that no longer exist, demolished to make room for developments that people like me could never afford," he said, accepting the tea with a nod of gratitude. "My mother worked 3 jobs to keep us fed. My father left when I was 7, unable to handle the shame of not being able to provide for his family." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled but genuine. Amara recognized the particular ache of childhood poverty, the way it shaped every future decision, the hypervigilance that came from never knowing if safety would last through the next day. "I understand," she said softly. "I grew up in foster care after my mother died. 12 different homes between the ages of 8 and 18. You learn to read people quickly when your safety depends on understanding who means you harm and who might actually care." Jinwoo set down his tea, giving her his full attention with the same intensity he applied to business negotiations. "Tell me about her. Your mother." The request caught her off guard. Most people, when they learned about her background, either offered empty sympathy or quickly changed the subject to avoid discomfort. Jinwoo asked because he genuinely wanted to know, because her pain mattered to him in ways that had nothing to do with obligation or strategy. "She was a nurse," Amara said, surprised by how easily the words came. Worked double shifts to pay for our tiny apartment, but she never missed reading me stories before bed. Even when she was exhausted, even when we barely had money for groceries, she made sure I knew that education was the path to a better life. What happened to her? Cancer. Fast and brutal. 6 months from diagnosis to death, and most of that time spent in hospitals that she couldn't afford. I was put into the system before she was even gone, because there was no family, no support network, no one else who could take responsibility for one more mouth to feed. The shared understanding of loss created a bridge between their different worlds. Jinwoo reached across the space between them, his fingers barely brushing hers in a gesture that was more comfort than romance, more recognition than attraction. She will be proud of who you became, he said quietly. Someone who shows compassion even when it costs her everything. Their conversations began to extend into the deeper territories of trust. Jinwoo spoke about the specific moment he had chosen violence over vulnerability, the day he realized that inspiring fear was more reliable than hoping for kindness. Amara shared her own hard-won wisdom about survival, the way she had learned to build strength from setbacks that would have broken someone with fewer resources or less determination. But it was the fever that revealed the depth of his feelings, the way his controlled concern transformed into something approaching desperation when her health became threatened rather than just her safety. She woke on a Thursday morning feeling like someone had filled her bones with concrete and set her skull on fire. The flu had been circulating through the city, and despite the compound's careful security, microscopic threats proved harder to control than human ones. By noon, she was running a temperature that had Jinwoo's personal physician making emergency house calls. The next 3 days passed in a haze of chills and sweats, of dreams that blended reality with delirium, of waking to find cool cloths being pressed to her forehead by hands that were gentle beyond anything she would have expected from a man who ruled through force. Jinwoo never left her side. He canceled meetings, delegated urgent business, and turned his attention entirely to the task of ensuring her recovery. When her fever spiked dangerously in the middle of the second night, she surfaced from unconsciousness to find him holding her hand, his dark eyes reflecting an anxiety that had nothing to do with losing a valuable asset and everything to do with the possibility of losing someone who had become essential to his existence in ways he was only beginning to understand. "You should not be here," she whispered, her voice raw from the fever. "You'll get sick." "I have survived worse than influenza," he replied, adjusting the damp cloth on her forehead with the careful attention of someone who had never performed such gentle tasks before. "Rest. Let me take care of you." The role reversal felt significant. This man who commanded absolute obedience from dangerous subordinates was learning tenderness through caring for someone who could offer him nothing but her presence. He brought her soup made by his personal chef, read to her from books he selected based on stories she had mentioned enjoying, and maintained a quiet vigil that spoke to devotion rather than duty. When her fever finally broke on the 4th day, she found him asleep in the chair beside her bed, still wearing the clothes from whatever meeting he had abandoned to rush to her side when her condition had worsened. His face in sleep looked younger, the lines of constant vigilance smoothed away to reveal the man he might have been in a world where survival had not demanded such careful armor. She watched him sleep and felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went beyond gratitude or physical attraction. This dangerous man had revealed his capacity for selfless care, had shown her a gentleness that existed beneath all his necessary cruelties, had demonstrated that his protection of her came from feelings he clearly had no intention of acting upon without her explicit invitation. When he stirred and found her watching him, their eyes met with an honesty that neither had allowed before. The careful distance they had maintained, the polite barriers that kept their growing connection safely theoretical, dissolve in the space between one breath and the next. "You stayed," she said, though it was not really a question. "I cannot leave," he admitted, his voice rough with exhaustion and something deeper. "The thought of losing you is unbearable." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither had the courage to cross. Amara saw the way his hands clenched with the effort of not reaching for her, the careful control he maintained even when his emotional walls were crumbling. He would not take advantage of her vulnerability, would not use her gratitude as permission to claim what he clearly wanted. The restraint made him more attractive, not less. This man who could command anything he desired through force or manipulation was choosing to want her from a distance, to protect her autonomy even when it meant denying his own needs. 2 days later, she found him in his office after what had obviously been a devastating business meeting. His usual controlled demeanor was strained, his dark eyes reflecting a frustration that spoke to significant losses, both financial and strategic. When she knocked, he looked up with the expression of someone who had been fighting a war he could not win. Without invitation, she entered his private space and settled into the chair across from his desk. "What happened?" she asked simply. "A year of careful planning destroyed by someone I trusted," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Shipments intercepted, routes exposed, months of work undone because I believed loyalty could be bought instead of earned. The betrayal had cost him more than money, she could see. It had shaken his faith in his ability to judge character, had reminded him that even careful control could not prevent every kind of loss." She rose from her chair and moved around his desk, ignoring his surprise as she placed her hands on his shoulders, offering the same gentle comfort he had shown during her illness. The touch was innocent but intimate, a gesture of care that acknowledged his pain without trying to fix what could not be repaired. "You will rebuild," she said quietly, feeling the tension in his muscles begin to ease under her hands. "You are stronger than one setback, smarter than one mistake." Jinwoo leaned into her touch with a vulnerability that transformed him from untouchable authority figure into someone who desperately needed the human connection he so carefully denied himself. When he looked up at her, his dark eyes held naked longing that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with the recognition that she saw him completely and chose to stay anyway. The moment stretched between them, full of possibilities neither was quite ready to explore. But the foundation had been laid, the emotional intimacy that would eventually overwhelm every practical objection to their impossible connection. They were falling in love despite every reason why such feelings should remain unthinkable, and both were beginning to understand that some forces were stronger than wisdom, more dangerous than bullets, and ultimately more powerful than the careful control that had once defined both their lives. The attack came during the weekly security rotation, when half of Jinwoo's personal guard was off duty and the compound's defenses were at their most vulnerable. Amara would later realize that this timing was no coincidence, that someone with intimate knowledge of their schedules had been feeding information to enemies who had been planning this assault for weeks. The betrayal cut deeper than the tactical disadvantage it created. Someone Jinwoo had trusted with operational details had sold that information to Chen Wei, the rival faction leader whose territory disputes with Jinwoo had been simmering for months. The personal nature of the breach would haunt Jinwoo for reasons that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with how completely he had failed to protect the person who mattered most to him. She was reading in the garden when the first explosions shattered the morning calm. The ornamental fountains that had seemed purely decorative revealed themselves as cover for defensive positions as armed men emerged from landscaping that had been designed to hide them. But the attackers had planned for this, arriving in sufficient numbers to overwhelm even Jinwoo's careful preparations. "Get inside," Jinwoo commanded, appearing beside her with the fluid grace of someone who had been expecting this moment, even while hoping it would never come. His hand found the small of her back, guiding her toward the main house with urgent efficiency. "Stay in your quarters. Lock the doors. Do not come out until I come for you personally." The controlled authority in his voice carried undertones of something approaching panic, though she knew he would die before admitting fear. This was the scenario that had driven every security decision, every careful protocol, every moment of vigilance since she had entered his protection. Someone had finally found a way through his defenses to reach the one person whose safety mattered more to him than his own survival. The house became a battlefield before they reached her wing. Windows exploded inward under coordinated gunfire, filling elegant rooms with smoke and shattered crystal. Jinwoo moved through the chaos with lethal precision, returning fire while shielding her body with his own, every movement calculated to keep her alive, even if it cost him his life. They were separated when a secondary team breached the building through the kitchen service entrance. The explosion knocked Amara to the ground, and when she struggled to her feet through the ringing in her ears, Jinwoo was gone, cut off by attackers who had clearly studied the compound's layout with military thoroughness. She made it to her quarters and locked the reinforced door, but the safety proved temporary. The men who came for her moved with the efficiency of professionals who had planned every detail of this operation, who knew exactly where to find her and how to extract her without triggering the remaining security systems. The electronic locks that Jinwoo had installed to give her control over her own space became meaningless when the attackers possessed override codes that should have been known only to the most trusted members of his inner circle. The door that had represented autonomy and safety swung open to reveal faces she had never seen before, men who looked at her with the cold assessment of people evaluating valuable cargo. They worked in practice silence, using hand signals and coordinated movements that spoke to military training and careful rehearsal. One secured the corridor, while another disabled the panic button Jinwoo had installed beside her bed, eliminating her ability to call for help even if she had possessed the time to reach it. The chloroform-soaked cloth pressed over her mouth carried the bitter scent of her own helplessness. As consciousness faded, her last clear thought was of Jinwoo's face when he realized she was gone, the way his carefully maintained control would shatter when he discovered that all his power had not been enough to keep her safe. She woke in a warehouse that smelled of rust and old violence, her wrists bound to a chair that had clearly hosted other unwilling guests. The man sitting across from her looked like a corporate executive who had decided that murder was simply another business transaction requiring proper preparation and professional execution. The space around them told its own story of careful preparation. Security cameras positioned to capture every angle, soundproofing that would muffle any screams, plastic sheeting that could be quickly disposed of after serving its purpose. Chun Wei had not simply planned her kidnapping. He had designed a perfect stage for Jinwoo's psychological destruction. "Miss Williams," he said with the polite formality of someone conducting a job interview rather than planning execution. "My name is Chun Wei, and I have been waiting a long time to make Park Jinwoo pay for his interference in my business operations." The calm civility in his voice was more terrifying than screaming threats would have been. This was someone who approached violence with the same methodical planning that others applied to legitimate enterprises, who saw her death as simply the most efficient way to cause Jinwoo the maximum possible suffering. "You see," Chun continued, settling back his chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who held all the advantages, "Jinwoo cost me $17 million when he disrupted my shipping operations last year. But money can be replaced. What cannot be replaced is reputation, respect, the fear that keeps lesser men in line. By taking you from the safety of his own compound, I demonstrate that his protection means nothing, that even his most careful precautions cannot prevent me from reaching what he values most. He will come for me," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Oh, I am counting on it," Chun replied with a smile that held no warmth. "That is the entire point. Jinwoo values your life more than his own survival, which makes you the perfect weapon to use against him. When he arrives, and he will arrive, he will be forced to choose between saving you and preserving his own life." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Chun had not taken her to ransom money or territory or business concessions that could be negotiated. He had taken the one thing Jinwoo would trade everything to recover, knowing that love made even the most dangerous men vulnerable in ways that fear never could. Hours passed in the growing certainty that she was going to die in this place, that her last conversation with Jinwoo had been about business logistics rather than the feelings neither of them had found the courage to acknowledge. She refused to give Chun the satisfaction of begging or offering him information about Jinwoo's operations, maintaining her dignity even when dignity was the only thing she had left to control. When the rescue came, it arrived with the sudden violence of a force of nature unleashed. The warehouse doors exploded inward under coordinated assault, and Jinwoo entered leading a team that moved with the precise brutality of soldiers who had been given unlimited permission to destroy anything that stood between them and their objective. The transformation was breathtaking to witness. This was not the controlled businessman who conducted elegant negotiations over expensive dinners, nor the thoughtful protector who had shown her such gentle care during her illness. This was the predator whose reputation had been built through demonstrations of exactly this kind of lethal competence. The man whose enemies spoke his name in whispers because they had seen what he was capable of when truly threatened. He moved through Chen's defenders with economical brutality, each shot placed with surgical precision, each movement designed to eliminate threats while advancing toward her location with unstoppable momentum. His team followed his lead with the synchronized efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this scenario, who understood that their leader's sanity depended on their ability to reach her alive. She had never seen him in full combat mode, had never witnessed the lethal competence that had built his reputation among men who respected only strength. The contrast between his usual careful restraint and this unleashed violence was staggering, a reminder that the gentle hands that had cared for her during her fever were equally capable of dealing death when circumstances required it. When their eyes met across the warehouse floor, his mask fell away completely. The controlled authority, the careful reserve, the political calculation that usually defined his every interaction disappeared, revealing raw emotion that transformed his face into something approaching desperation mixed with overwhelming relief. In that moment, she understood that saving her had become more important to him than his own survival, that he had risked everything he had built on the possibility of reaching her in time. The knowledge should have terrified her, but instead it completed something inside her that had been incomplete since the night they met. Chun made the mistake of using those seconds to press a gun to her temple, thinking that Jinwoo's feelings for her would paralyze him with indecision. Instead, the threat triggered a response that was faster and more lethal than anything the rival boss could have anticipated. Jinwoo's shot took Chun between the eyes before the man could complete his threat, ending the standoff with a kind of precision that left no room for negotiation or mercy. The aftermath passed in a blur of gentle hands cutting her restraints, of being gathered into arms that trembled with the aftermath of violence and the overwhelming reality of her survival. Jinwoo held her with desperate intensity, his face buried in her hair, his breathing uneven with emotions he no longer had the strength to suppress. "I thought I had lost you," he whispered against her temple, his voice broken with an honesty that revealed the depths of his feelings more clearly than any declaration could have. "The thought of existing in a world without you was unbearable." Amara felt her own walls crumble as she realized that this dangerous man was shaking in her arms, that his love for her had made him vulnerable in ways his enemies could use against him, that protecting her might ultimately cost him everything he had built. Instead of weakening him, the knowledge made her love him more completely. "I am here," she said simply, her hands finding his face, forcing him to look at her. "I am alive because you came for me, because you love me enough to risk everything." The admission hung between them like a bridge finally built across impossible distance. Jinwoo's hands cupped her face with infinite gentleness, his dark eyes searching hers for permission to speak the words that would change everything between them. "I would burn down the world to keep you safe," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "I would destroy everything I have built, abandon everything I have earned, sacrifice everything I possess if it meant protecting you from harm." The declaration should have terrified her, should have reminded her that loving a man capable of such devotion meant accepting responsibility for the choices he would make in her name. Instead, she felt the last of her resistance dissolve as she accepted that some loves were worth every risk, some connections transcended every practical objection. "I love you," she said, the words carrying the weight of complete surrender to feelings that have been growing despite every reason why they should remain impossible. I love you knowing exactly who you are, what you do, what loving you means for my future. Their first kiss tasted of smoke and desperation, of relief and recognition, of two people who had finally stopped fighting the gravity that had been pulling them together since the moment he had begged her to save his life in an upscale restaurant that now felt like it existed in someone else's story. The kiss deepened with the hungry intensity of people who had almost lost the chance to express what they felt, who understood that some opportunities came only once and must not be wasted on hesitation or fear. Jinwoo's hands tangled in her hair with desperate reverence, holding her as if she might disappear again if he loosened his grip even slightly. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Amara saw her own transformation reflected in his eyes. She was no longer the waitress who had accidentally stumbled into his world, no longer the innocent woman who needed protection from dangers she did not understand. The warehouse around them bore witness to what loving him would mean, the violence that would always lurk at the edges of their existence, the enemies who would see her as leverage to use against him. But she also saw the team of loyal men who had followed Jinwoo into certain danger because they understood that some things were worth dying for. The resources he commanded, the absolute devotion he was capable of when someone earned his protection. "You realize what this means?" he said quietly, his forehead resting against hers. "Loving me will make you a target for every enemy I have. There will be no safety, no normal life, no escape from the reality of who I am and what I do." "I know exactly what it means," she replied, her hands finding his face, forcing him to look directly at her. "I choose it anyway. I choose you, knowing the costs, accepting the risks, understanding that loving you means becoming someone strong enough to survive in your world." The declaration transformed something fundamental in his expression. For the first time since she had known him, Jinwoo looked at her without any trace of the protective reserve he maintained with everyone else. She saw complete emotional surrender, absolute trust, the kind of vulnerability that could destroy him if she chose to use it against him. She had become someone willing to love a dangerous man completely, someone strong enough to accept the costs and complications that such love would demand, someone who understood that the safest place in her chaotic world was in the arms of the man everyone else feared most. The woman who walked out of that warehouse was not the same person who had been taken from the compound that morning, and neither of them would ever again pretend that what existed between them was merely protection, obligation, or temporary arrangement. They belonged to each other now, completely and irrevocably, in ways that would remake both their lives and destroy anyone who tried to come between them. The war that had brought them together was far from over, but they would face whatever came next as partners, as equals, as two people who had chosen love over safety and found strength they had never known they possessed. The elimination of Chun Wei's network took 3 weeks of methodical precision that demonstrated why Jinwoo had survived in a world where mercy was weakness and hesitation meant death. But this was not the cold business calculation that usually drove his strategic decisions. This was personal in ways that made his associates step carefully around him, recognizing that their leader was operating from a place of protective fury that left no room for half measures or negotiated settlements. Amara watched him orchestrate the dismantling of every threat to their future with the same thorough attention he had once applied to protecting her from shadows and possibilities. Now he moved against concrete enemies with names and addresses, eliminating each member of Chen's organization with surgical efficiency that left no loose ends, no surviving grudges, no possibility of future retaliation. She did not ask for details about the methods he employed, understanding instinctively that some knowledge would burden rather than enlighten her. What mattered was the result: a world where she could exist without looking over her shoulder, where their love could grow without the constant specter of her death being used as leverage against him. The compound felt different when the last external threat had been neutralized. Security remained tight, but the hypervigilance that had defined every interaction relaxed into something approaching normal life. Jinwoo's staff moved with less tension. His business meetings resumed their usual rhythms, and the future became something they could plan rather than simply hope to survive. It was during this period of newfound safety that Jinwoo revealed the depth of his transformation. The way loving her had fundamentally altered not just his priorities, but his understanding of what kind of life was worth building. She found him in his office on a Thursday evening, but instead of the usual reports and strategic documents, his desk held architectural plans and property deeds. When he looked up at her arrival, his expression carried nervous anticipation that seemed almost foreign on features usually defined by unwavering confidence. "What are all these?" she asked, settling into the chair that had become hers during their evening conversations. "Options," he replied, spreading the documents so she could examine them properly. "Possibilities for a different kind of future than either of us originally imagined." The plans showed estates in countries that did not have extradition treaties with South Korea, legitimate businesses that could generate wealth without requiring the constant management of violence, properties where they could build something together that had no connection to the world that had brought them together. "You are asking me to disappear with you," she said, studying the careful detail that had gone into each proposal. "I am asking you to start over with me," he corrected gently. "To build something new that belongs to both of us rather than accepting inheritance of everything I built before I knew you existed." The offer represented sacrifice on a scale that staggered her. Jinwoo was proposing to abandon an empire he had spent 15 years constructing, to walk away from power and territory and the complex web of relationships that defined his existence, all for the chance to create something clean with someone who had fundamentally changed his understanding of what mattered. "Why?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because everything I built before was about survival and control and the accumulation of power for its own sake," he said, his voice carrying quiet conviction. "Because what we have together is worth more than anything I could accomplish alone. Because I want to spend the rest of my life becoming the man you deserve, rather than remaining the man circumstances force me to become." The proposal was more than romantic, it was revolutionary. This man who had commanded through fear and maintained authority through the careful application of violence was choosing love over power, partnership over domination, a future built on mutual respect rather than the inheritance of past necessities. But even as she felt her heart respond to the beauty of his vision, Amara recognized that accepting his sacrifice would fundamentally alter the balance between them in ways that might ultimately undermine the very qualities that had made her love him. "No," she said quietly, and watched his face transform with carefully suppressed devastation before she continued. "I do not want you to abandon everything you are for me. I want you to transform it with me." The distinction mattered more than he initially understood. She had not fallen in love with a reformed criminal trying to escape his past, but with a powerful man who wielded danger with honor and protected what mattered to him with absolute devotion. Asking him to renounce that power would diminish rather than elevate what they could build together. "I want to be your partner in everything," she explained, reaching across his desk to cover his hands with hers. "Not the reason you retreat from your world, but the reason you reshape it into something worthy of both of us." The conversation that followed stretched deep into the night, exploring possibilities neither had considered when they imagined their future separately. Jinwoo could maintain his position while transitioning toward legitimate enterprises that serve the same communities his organization had always claimed to protect. Amara could apply her business education to operations that had never benefited from someone who understood both strategic planning and the ethical frameworks that could transform necessary evils into genuine services. Together, they began designing a future that honored both his strength and her principles, that preserved the protection his power provided while channeling it toward purposes that could survive scrutiny from any authority. It was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible, but they had already accomplished the impossible simply by finding each other and choosing love over every practical objection. 3 months later, Jinwoo made his formal proposal during a gathering of his entire organization, transforming what could have been private intimacy into public declaration that left no room for misunderstanding about Amara's place in his world. The ceremony took place in the compound's main hall, with associates and allies who had gathered to witness not just a wedding, but the formal integration of someone who would share authority rather than simply benefit from protection. When Jinwoo introduced her as his partner in every sense that mattered, the response from his people was respectful acceptance that spoke to their recognition of her strength rather than mere tolerance of their leader's choice. The vows they exchanged had been written to acknowledge the unusual nature of their union, the fact that their love had been forged through crisis and would be tested by challenges that normal couples never faced. Jinwoo promised not just devotion but partnership, not just protection but respect for her autonomy, even when autonomy might seem dangerous. Amara promised not just love but loyalty, not just acceptance of his world, but active participation in transforming it into something they could both take pride in building. The ring he placed on her finger was platinum and diamonds, beautiful in its simplicity but significant for what it represented. This was not a cage disguised as jewelry, but a symbol of chosen commitment that she could remove at any time but would never want to relinquish. Their first dance was performed to music that bridged their different cultures. Korean traditional melodies woven together with American jazz in a fusion that seemed to predict the kind of life they would create together. When Jinwoo held her close enough to whisper in her ear, his words were promises about the future they would build in gratitude for the salvation she had provided simply by seeing him as worthy of love. The reception revealed the extent to which his organization had already begun adapting to her presence and influence. Business discussions included considerations that had never been relevant when profit was the only measure of success. Plans were evaluated not just for their strategic value, but for their impact on communities that would be affected by their implementation. She had not demanded these changes, had never issued ultimatums about the moral implications of his enterprises. But her presence had created space for conversations about purpose and responsibility that had been impossible when survival was the only priority worth considering. As their wedding night approached, Amara reflected on the journey that had brought them from that desperate moment in the restaurant to this celebration of chosen partnership. The woman who had saved his life had been motivated by compassion and quick thinking. The woman who married him was choosing a future that would challenge both of them to become better versions of themselves than either could achieve alone. When they finally retreated to privacy, Jinwoo carried her across the threshold of quarters that had been redesigned to belong to both of them rather than serving as guest accommodation in his domain. The space reflected their partnership in its fusion of elegant minimalism with warm comfort, luxury balanced with the kind of safety that came from being completely known by someone who would protect both your vulnerabilities and your strengths. Their wedding night was both culmination and beginning, the claiming of what had been growing between them since that first moment of desperate trust and the foundation for intimacy that would deepen rather than diminish as they faced whatever challenges the future held. In the quiet afterward, as Jinwoo held her with the reverent care of someone who still could not quite believe his good fortune, Amara understood that she had found something rarer than safety or comfort or even passionate love. She had found partnership with someone whose strength amplified rather than diminished her own, whose protection empowered rather than constrained her, whose devotion was expressed through respect rather than possession. The dangerous world they inhabited had not become safe, but had become manageable through their shared strength. The future they faced together would include challenges that might have broken either of them individually, but they would meet those challenges as equals, as partners, as two people who had chosen each other completely and would spend their lives proving worthy of that choice. As they fell asleep in each other's arms, the last thing Amara saw was the platinum ring that caught the moonlight streaming through windows that no longer needed to be barred against threats that had been eliminated rather than simply avoided. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that love could indeed transform rather than simply survive the darkness. But tonight, they were exactly where they belonged, in the safety of a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, more precious, and more permanent than anything either of them had dared to hope for when their story began with a desperate plea for salvation in a restaurant where death had been disguised as a business dinner. What did you think of this love story that bloomed in the most unexpected circumstances? Have you ever had to make a choice between safety and love, between what was practical and what your heart demanded? I would love to hear your thoughts about Amara and Jinwoo's journey from strangers to partners. Share your reactions in the comments below.